I saw her. Sitting across from him, my eyes shining with an enthusiasm that was no longer mine. She didn't know I was there, hidden behind a pillar in the restaurant we frequented together on special occasions, as if the place only carried the memory of those who truly valued it. As she smiled, moving her hair, telling the man in front of her that this was just a business meeting, I felt every cell in my body tighten in silent fury. I knew it wasn't. She was there with her boss, the man who used to shake my hand at year-end get-togethers, who told me, with false politeness, that I was a lucky man to have a woman like her. Now I understand, he already wanted her, maybe he even had her. And she, the woman I loved, didn't hesitate to return the flirtation hidden behind glasses of wine and glances disguised as professional discussion. It was there, at that exact moment that I heard her laugh at something he said, a laugh I hadn't heard in months, that I made my decision. She wouldn't make a fool of me. I planned a divorce she would never forget, an outcome worthy of the theater she put on while she believed I was still blind. And the most curious thing, she didn't suspect anything. She continued living next to me, pretending to be a wife, coming home with the smell of his perfume permeating the blazer that she wore only for important meetings. Deep down, she believed she could maintain both worlds, maintain the comfort I provided and the cheap adrenaline of the extramarital affair. But what she didn't know, and what would transform the course of our lives forever, was that I had anticipated it. Her every step was being watched, recorded, stored. Every lie, every, I need to stay late, every, the boss called me for a last-minute dinner. I let her believe it. I fed her illusion until she was certain I was still the same submissive, passionate man. I even complimented her at breakfast, prepared her flowers on random days, and kissed her like it was a first date. She mistook my pain for love. He mistook my silence for acceptance. And that's where the weak make mistakes, the silent ones, sometimes, are the ones who know the most. But the game really changed the day I arrived, unannounced, at that dinner. I walked in without making a sound, and when she saw me, she froze. The fork slipped out of his hand. The face lost color. And he, the boss, the man who thought he could eat from my desk while complimenting me behind my back, was speechless. She jumped up, dropping the glass, and came to me saying, "Baby, I can explain." I stared at her without blinking. I had rehearsed that expression for days. "This is a business meeting," she repeated, her voice trembling, her eyes searching for a shred of truth to sustain her. But I just smiled, with the calmness of someone who didn't need to shout. I knew enough. I knew everything. And at that same moment, in front of everyone, with my coworkers at nearby tables, with the sound of the waiter knocking over the cork in the background, I announced our divorce. The way she never imagined. With a serenity that hurt more than a slap. "Don't worry, dear. I've already taken care of everything. Including the company where you work." And she was there, without understanding. Still smiling mechanically. Still looking for ground. But I was no longer her man. I was something else. A consequence. A reflection of her betrayal. What she didn't yet know, and neither did the world around her, was that I had silently bought part of the company. That I was now a partner of the same man who was sleeping with my wife. And that, the next day, she would discover that her position had been reassigned. To another floor. Another function. With another salary. That the promotion she expected wouldn't come. And that the lover, his boss, would also be forced to accept my presence in the boardroom. This wasn't just revenge. It was a class. A demonstration of how to survive pain with elegance and coolness. Because for some betrayals, silence is worth more than any scream. And for certain truths, only power is enough to sustain them without collapsing. She never suspected anything because she never believed I would be capable. Because you confused my love with weakness, my trust with passivity, and my absence with defeat. She never realized she was sleeping next to the man who would destroy her with a smile on his face and a contract in his hand. Over the next few weeks, she tried to convince me that it had all been a mistake. Which was confusion, loneliness, lack. That man meant nothing. He cried. He called me in the early hours of the morning. He sent letters. He asked for a chance. He said it was just a phase and that what we had was bigger. But I had already buried our love. With flowers, ironically. The same ones she received and thought were proof of passion. Little did I know they were goodbyes. And the cruelest thing, she still had to see me every day, in the same building, in the same elevator, in the same corridors. And every emotionless look I gave was more painful than any response. She was surrounded by her own choice. And he, the lover, started to live under my shadow. Because I was now part of it all. I was the new name in the boardroom. The new vote in strategic decisions. And her. Just one employee. The curious thing is that the more she shrank, the more I grew. And it was during this reconstruction that I met someone. Someone who didn't look at what I had lost, but at what I had become. A different, sensitive and direct woman. And for the first time, I found myself wishing for another life. A new beginning. No lies. No disguises. And the final irony, while the woman who betrayed me was begging for forgiveness, I was in love again. But now, with open eyes. Because betrayal has the power to destroy. But it also has the power to reveal who you really are. What she didn't know, and still doesn't know, is what I did with all the evidence I collected. The messages. The videos. The audios. Everything archived with a purpose. Everything saved for a specific moment. Because there's still one last piece left on that board. And when she is revealed, her world will fall apart for good. And then, she will be the one who sees it. Alone. Sitting in front of the mirror of her own conscience, asking herself not why she did what she did, but how she didn't see what I was doing while she was pretending to deceive me. Now tell me, what would you do if you discovered that your marriage was a stage and you, without knowing it, were the scriptwriter for the downfall of the one you loved most? Welcome to the channel. Here, we never support any type of betrayal. On the contrary, our stories show how it can destroy lives, hearts and families. The narratives are fictional, but the pain is real, because the moral is clear: cheating has consequences. Get ready, what you're going to hear now is a shocking, intense and unforgettable story. Good story. His name was Daniel. He was 38 years old, with calm, almost grayish blue eyes and a silent way of observing the world that made everything around him seem to slow down. He was a civil engineer, methodical, organized, one of those men who still believed in keeping promises even when the world no longer valued it so much. He grew up in a family where his father, austere and hardworking, taught that silence was worth more than thoughtless words, and that love meant building something every day, like someone who builds a building, brick by brick, without rushing. Daniel followed this principle in his life. Everything he had was built with effort, prudence and an almost naive faith that, with love and dedication, anything could last forever. His marriage to Helena was, for many years, the mirror of this ideal. Helena was the opposite in many ways. Owner of a vibrant energy, she was one of those people who entered a room and automatically caught people's eyes. Communicative, determined from a young age to carve out her own space, she built an admirable career in the marketing area and, before the age of 30, reached the management of one of the largest technology companies in the sector. He had a strategic mind and a natural charm, capable of convincing with a smile and disconcerting with a word. He met Daniel when he was still an assistant, at a lecture on innovation and sustainability where he was one of the speakers. As he spoke seriously and precisely about structures and risks, she watched him with an interest that mixed admiration and a kind of silent challenge. It was she who took the first step. He, being cautious, needed time. But when it gave way, it was whole. Their relationship grew in a tenuous but effective balance. Daniel offered security, calm and constancy. Helena brought movement, color, and ambition. They married after 2 years of dating and, for a long time, they seemed to function like two distinct hemispheres of the same brain. The house they built together was spacious, elegant, with straight lines, neutral tones and modern details chosen by her. He took care of the repairs, the garden, the little details that ensured everything was always in order. She took care of the most daring trips, events, financial and professional decisions. They had well-defined routines. They had coffee together in the morning, talked about the day's plans, exchanged brief messages at lunch and had dinner side by side most nights. He loved watching Helena cook on Sundays, when she put the executive aside and indulged in complicated recipes that almost always went wrong, but filled the house with laughter and lightness. Despite their differences, there was genuine affection between them. Daniel loved her intensity, even if he sometimes felt swallowed by her strength. And Helena, even impatient with his slowness in making decisions, recognized the rare nobility in his simplicity. They weren't perfect, but they had a pact: they would grow together. When they bought a country house a few hours from the city, he was the one who insisted on every detail of the renovation, even working late. He said he wanted a place where they could get away from it all once in a while. She, at first, found the idea romantic and even posed for photos smiling next to the bonfire. But over time, the weekends began to be divided between the field and her commitments, which only increased. Daniel, in turn, never complained. He said he understood, that it was the price of her success, and that he admired her determination. At times, he seemed convinced that love was accepting all absences without demanding presence. Helena's social circle was different from Daniel's. She met with executives, advertisers, high-performance professionals who seemed to speak a different language than the one he used on a daily basis. At events, Daniel accompanied her with a certain discomfort hidden beneath well-pressed shirts and restrained smiles. I preferred to stay next to the buffet, watching. I noticed how it floated among the guests, like a magnetic field. She also noticed the looks that other men were giving her. But I never said anything. Never made a scene. His pride and confidence were silent shields. He believed that love was a type of faith: it couldn't be explained, it couldn't be questioned, it could only be cultivated. Helena noticed his silence, sometimes with tenderness, other times with irritation. I thought he could be more jealous, more reactive, more passionate. But Daniel was constant, and she mistook that for coldness. Over time, the first disagreements came. Small delays, extended meetings, trips that coincided with important dates. Nothing that seemed serious. But Daniel began to notice her absence in previously sacred places: the couch on Sunday afternoons, the silent cafes at dawn, the spontaneous touch in the middle of the night. Helena was still present, but in a functional way. She carried out the rituals, but without the sparkle that previously made her unpredictable. When he tried to talk, she said she was tired, that the pressure at work was greater, and that he needed to be more understanding. And he went. As it always was. On their 8-year wedding anniversary, Daniel hosted an intimate dinner at home. He cooked, lit candles, played the music they used to listen to at the beginning of the relationship. Helena arrived late, visibly exhausted. He said he didn't need all that, that they could have gone to a restaurant. He hid his disappointment. Smiled. He said it was fine. But that night marked him. For the first time, he felt like maybe they were on different pages of the same book. At work, Daniel continued to be respected. It had a solid team, challenging projects, and an impeccable reputation. But his personal life was beginning to look like his drawing boards, full of straight, predictable lines, without the curve of emotion that once existed. Helena was climbing the professional ladder faster and faster. She was promoted, started to participate in meetings with members of senior management, and traveled to international conferences. Daniel celebrated each achievement, even when she couldn't be there to toast him. He guarded her victories as if they were his own. They had no children. By choice. Helena said that it wasn't time yet, that she wanted to consolidate herself, that it was better to wait. Daniel, deep down, wanted it. I imagined a boy with her eyes, a girl with her calmness. But he didn't insist. He said he respected it. And respected. He began to channel this desire to his nephews, to the dog they adopted, to his friends' godchildren. She, in turn, never showed guilt about it. I was too busy winning, being recognized, applauded. And Daniel, in his stillness, sincerely rooted for her, even as the void silently grew between them. At family dinners, comments about how they were an exemplary couple became more frequent. Many cited them as a reference to balance, maturity, and companionship. Daniel smiled, but at certain moments, he noticed a distant look on Helena's face, as if the idea of being an example weighed more than it inspired. Sometimes, during these meetings, he would try to hold her hand under the table, but she was always busy with her cell phone, answering some urgent email. When they traveled, he focused on the details. She chose the tours, planned the itineraries, made reservations in places she said she loved. But something seemed missing. She smiled, yes. But it was the kind of smile that didn't last long, that didn't reach the eyes. And he saw that. Even so, Daniel believed they were just going through a phase. Every couple passes. That's what he said to himself, every night, as he made the bed next to her. Helena, in turn, believed that perhaps he was settling down, that he no longer saw in her the ambitious woman who once challenged him to leave his comfort zone. The two were trapped in unspoken expectations, in accumulated silences, in routine gestures that once symbolized love and now sounded like obligation. But the world, even though it seems immobile, is always moving beneath the feet of those who are distracted. And it was in this terrain, made up of routines and concessions, that something began to germinate without Daniel realizing it. It wasn't something sudden. Not noisy. It grew in the interval between silences, in the gestures that became automatic, in the nights that ended without exchanging glances, in the Sundays that turned into Monday before it even got dark. Until, one day, Daniel noticed a detail. Small. Almost irrelevant. But enough to spark a question in him. And at that moment, a silent gear began to move inside him. He didn't know yet. But everything that would come later would be born from that moment in which something seemingly insignificant made him look at the world with different eyes. And from then on, nothing would be the same again. Daniel began to notice the change in small gestures, like someone feeling the presence of a cold current passing through a half-open window. It wasn't something glaring, nor clearly visible. There were micro-expressions, unnecessary pauses between words, smiles that previously appeared spontaneously and now seemed rehearsed. Helena's touch when saying goodbye in the morning, which was once a light kiss on the corner of the mouth, turned into a distracted brush on the shoulder. The messages that used to arrive in the middle of the day with inside jokes have become short, functional responses, as if communication now only serves the purpose of informing, and no longer connecting. She said she was overwhelmed, and he believed her. Not because he was naive, but because his nature was to trust before distrusting, to wait before accusing. In his mind, everything could be adjusted with patience, with love and presence. But something inside him began to ferment in silence, like something that wants to emerge but has no form yet. That night, it rained. Helena arrived late, soaked and visibly tired. He said that the meeting had extended and that he was unable to notify him because he ran out of battery. Daniel prepared some tea, left the clean towel on the back of the sofa, and heard her sigh as she took off her shoes. She didn't notice the bouquet of wilted flowers he had thrown in the trash. He watched her settle in and, for the first time in a long time, felt like she was a stranger in his room. The way she crossed her legs, how she avoided his gaze when he asked how the day was, how she always responded with the same phrase, everything was fine, as always. There was an abyss there, and he was on the edge, trying to decide whether he should jump to the other side or just accept that he had fallen a long time ago. At work, Daniel spent more time in the office than he would have liked. But it wasn't out of necessity, but rather out of escape. I avoided coming home early. I spent long periods of time in front of the computer looking at reports I had already reviewed. He began going out for longer lunches, lingering in cafes, observing the people around him with a curiosity he hadn't felt in years. It was as if the world around him was becoming clearer while his own was becoming increasingly hazy. On one of these afternoons, a longtime friend met him by chance and commented, with a crooked smile, that he had seen Helena in a restaurant, very well accompanied. It must have been a business meeting, of course. But the way she smiled at the man in front of her, well, I just thought about what a calm man you are. Daniel just smiled, but his throat caught. The comment reverberated within him for days, like an echo in an empty cave. From then on, he began to notice things that he previously ignored. Helena's excessive care when getting ready for certain meetings. The sudden change in cell phone password. The whispers on the phone with the office door closed. The smell of men's perfume occasionally permeated coats she said she wore alone. Small delays that didn't match his almost obsessive punctuality. Started testing. He left notes in unlikely places, checking to see if they were read. I would forget things on purpose just to see if she would notice. But nothing. It was as if he was never seen again. As if she had built another parallel world, where he didn't exist. And that hurt more than any possible betrayal. The absence of reaction, of care, of interest. The distance between them became almost physical. They slept in the same bed, but their bodies no longer touched. They had dinner together, but the conversations were about the news, the week's commitments or the dog. He asked her to go to the cinema, she refused. She suggested a weekend trip, she claimed an unpostponable conference. In one of these refusals, Daniel offered to accompany. She said she could take advantage of the time to rest at the hotel and get to know the city while she completed her schedule. Helena hesitated. He said it would be too rushed, that it wouldn't make sense. And for the first time, Daniel didn't insist. He just nodded, with empty eyes, and went back to washing the dishes with more force than necessary. One day, as she passed in front of her company building, she decided to park her car and wait. He didn't know what he was looking for, he just felt like he needed to see it with his own eyes. He stayed in the car for almost 2 hours, watching the employees leave, talking, laughing, saying goodbye with gestures of someone who would return the next day. And then he saw her. Leaving through the side door, with hurried steps and looking around as if trying to make sure he wasn't being observed. Behind her, an older man in a dark suit came out smiling, saying something that made her turn away with a shy laugh. They walked away, got into the same car, and drove off. Daniel did not follow them. He remained still, feeling the blood pulsing in his temples, trying to find a thought that didn't hurt. That night was silent. Helena arrived late and said she had had a problem with the supplier. He didn't eat, he didn't ask about his day, he went upstairs and locked himself in his room. Daniel stayed in the kitchen for almost an hour, holding the glass of water with both hands. At some point, he also climbed up, lay down with his back to her and closed his eyes. But he didn't sleep. And it was there, in the dark, listening to the light breathing of the woman he loved, that he decided not to just investigate. Decided to understand. I needed to know how far the abyss went. And if there was any possible bridge between him and the truth. Hired an investigator. Not out of impulse, but out of necessity. I didn't want confrontations based on assumptions. I wanted proof. Numbers, dates, images. For days, he received discreet reports, full of details that he read like someone leafing through a horror book. Meetings in hotels. Frequent lunches in restaurants outside the usual circuit. Trips that were not on the agenda. Gifts received. A behavior too careful to be accidental. And finally, a photo. She, holding hands with the man Daniel immediately identified. The same one who shook his hand at corporate events, who praised him with false sympathy, who said he admired their stability as a couple. Daniel didn't react with screams. There were no explosions. He sat for long minutes staring into space, breathing deeply. The ground seemed to have dissolved beneath his feet, but he did not allow hatred to dominate. There was hurt, yes. And disappointment. But what consumed him most was the shattering of what he always believed to be unshakable. The pact. The construction. The idea that they were together for something greater than their own desires. Now it all seemed like an extra-long act. And his role had only been that of a static supporting character, who doesn't notice when he is replaced in the script of his own life. He continued acting as if nothing had changed. I was still preparing breakfast. He still said good night. He still commented on the weather or the news. But inside, something had died. He began to draw his plan. A divorce that wasn't just an end, but a lesson. A silent, devastating and unstoppable movement. And for that, I needed to wait. Time was his ally now. She, wrapped in her illusion of impunity, was not suspicious. She continued to sneak out, smiling through the company's corridors, lying with the confidence of someone who has never been unmasked. It was then that the invitation came. A business dinner with the top brass of her company. A networking opportunity that Helena presented to him as if it were something new, unpretentious. He said it would be quick, that he didn't need to go. But Daniel insisted. He said he wanted to get to know the environment where she shined better. Helena hesitated for a second, but then smiled, agreeing. And that night, he went. It arrived early. He sat down strategically. And he saw her arrive, side by side with the man who, until then, only existed in reports and in the cold images of a dossier. She laughed. He touched her arm. Helena's look was different. A look that Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. And then she saw him. Sitting, watching, unshakable. The blood drained from her face. The fork fell out of his hand. The smile died on his lips. She stood up, trying to compose herself, and walked towards him. He tried to smile. He said that everything was part of a company plan, a strategy to get closer to the board. Daniel didn't say anything. He just looked at her with the serenity of someone who already knew. And in that instant, she understood that she had lost control. But what she didn't yet know, what no one in that room knew, was that the real blow was yet to come. Because Daniel wasn't just the betrayed husband. He was now something bigger. Something that would change everything. And no one was prepared for what would come after that night. The atmosphere at dinner was as dense as a sky about to collapse. The silence that followed Daniel's unexpected appearance spread like an icy wave, freezing gazes and paralyzing words. Helena remained standing, static, in front of him, with her face pale and her eyes wide, as if trying to decipher what he knew, how much he had seen, how much he could destroy. Beside her, the man who called himself her boss tried to maintain his posture, adjusting his collar with trembling fingers, as if this were just an administrative setback. But Daniel's eyes were not on either of them. He observed the surroundings, the curious faces, the restrained whispers, the involuntary audience of a play that he himself wrote with millimeter patience. When he finally looked at Helena, there was no anger in his eyes. There was a decision. She tried to smile, tried an excuse, but he just extended the formal invitation he had received from the company itself, as if offering proof that he didn't land there by parachute. She couldn't hide her panic. And it was at that moment that the scenario changed. Daniel excused himself, went to the event central table and announced, in a firm and calm voice, his entry as a new partner in the company. The hall was plunged into murmurs. Helena let out a muffled sound, between a sigh and a sob, while the man next to her immediately turned pale. Daniel smiled discreetly, thanked everyone for coming, and said he was eager to contribute to the company, especially now that he had decided to personally invest in new ethical leadership standards. It was a veiled statement, but those who knew how to read between the lines understood. And for her, it was like a punch in the stomach. In the following days, everything changed. Helena tried to get in touch in every way. He sent long messages, emotional emails, handwritten letters. Daniel read each word as if analyzing the rubble of a house that had been burned down. There was no way to reconstruct what had been consumed. He responded only with silence. At work, rumors spread. The woman who was once the face of innovation now walked the halls weighed down by judgmental gazes. I no longer smiled easily. He no longer spoke enthusiastically. Daniel's shadow was constant. Her presence in meetings, in strategic decisions, in the corridors where she previously reigned supreme, now represents a painful reminder of the price of each choice. But what she didn't know, what he still held on to as the last piece of a meticulous plan, was what was about to come. The real secret. The thing that would redefine everything she thought she knew about power, loyalty and loss. On a gray Friday afternoon, Helena was called to an extraordinary meeting. When he arrived at the room, Daniel was already there. Sitting at the headboard, with a black folder in front of him, and a serene look that hid the approaching storm. There were other directors present, all silent. She entered with tense shoulders and a pale face, but maintaining the pose of someone who would not let herself be shaken. Daniel invited her to sit. He said that the time had come to align interests and clarify some pending issues. Helena nodded, trying to maintain her composure, but her heart was beating like a wild drum. Daniel then opened the folder. Inside, a series of documents, images, contracts. But it wasn't about the betrayal. That was already over, it was no longer necessary to discuss what they both knew. What he revealed was something else. Something she could never have imagined. With his voice still calm, Daniel explained that in recent months he had acquired not only shares in the company, but also the majority rights to a strategic subsidiary recently integrated into the group. This subsidiary was responsible for an emerging technology, a promising project in which Helena had personally invested her reputation. It was, in a way, the future of the company. And now, unbeknownst to her, Daniel was the sole holder of operational control over this project. More than that, he had redirected the unit's plans. She, who expected to be promoted to lead this front, had been officially removed from management, a decision approved by the board after allegations of conflict of interest and inappropriate conduct in the corporate environment. Helena opened her eyes wide, unable to hide her shock. She tried to argue, to say that there had never been any improper use of influence, but Daniel interrupted her with cruel calm. She said the Internal Ethics Committee had received sufficient evidence, including records of conversations between her and her former superior, conversations she never imagined could be monitored. The board heard everything in silence. Helena, previously haughty, now trembled. He tried to keep his pride upright, but his voice failed. He said they were being unfair, that the whole situation was personal, that he was using his power to get revenge. Daniel just handed over a copy of the report. A robust, technical, impersonal document. He said there was no emotion there. Just facts. The data spoke for itself. But there was more. Daniel then revealed the final blow. While she believed that his name still carried prestige, he had made agreements with international partners to reallocate the project's investment to another company unit, under new management, in another country. A move that would leave Helena's name out of the biggest transformation that the company would see in the coming years. She couldn't answer. She sat there, her eyes lost, her face motionless. And then, like someone holding on to the last plank of a shipwreck, he asked, in an almost childish voice, why? Daniel took a deep breath, looked into her eyes and said it wasn't for revenge. It was for justice. He said that for years he built a life based on trust and loyalty, and that when all of that was thrown away by momentary desires, he didn't just destroy a marriage. He lost his ground, his plans, his faith. But instead of drowning, he decided to swim. And now, it would no longer be part of the fund. He said he didn't wish her harm, he just wanted her to know, firsthand, what it's like to lose everything you believed you had under control. Helena left the room like a specter. I didn't say goodbye. He didn't look back. Daniel remained seated, silent. For the first time in a long time, he felt no pain. He felt relief. I knew that moment didn't fix the past. But perhaps it was the beginning of a new story, where he would no longer be a spectator. And where the roles, finally, were clear. But destiny still had something in store that not even he had predicted. And that, yes, would change everything. Helena took 2 days to reappear. Since the meeting, she disappeared from all her commitments, turned off her phone, avoided her colleagues, and sank into a silence that was unbearable for her. She spent the first 24 hours locked in her own apartment, where everything screamed her name, the paintings, the diplomas, the awards lined up on the shelves like indestructible achievements. For the first time, he looked at those victories and felt ashamed. It wasn't just because of what he had lost, but because of how he had lost it. All of that hadn't been ripped away by force. It was taken slowly, as if someone had planned each move while she believed she had control of all the pieces. She spent the morning awake, mentally reviewing each step that took her there, trying to find the exact moment in which she crossed the line between self-confidence and arrogance. The man she had dismissed as predictable was now the same man who had disarmed her world with surgical coldness. And it destroyed her inside. On the third day, he knocked on Daniel's door. I didn't know what I would say. He didn't plan a speech, he didn't think about justifications. She just knew she needed to see him, as if his presence was the only chance to understand what was left of her. He took a while to answer. When the door opened, they were face to face for the first time outside of a professional environment. Daniel was different. He wore simple clothes, but there was a calmness in his eyes that hurt her more than any accusation. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. He just looked, waited. And when she whispered his name, he stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The room looked the same, but there was something missing. The wedding portrait, which previously rested on the bookshelf, was gone. They sat opposite each other, in silence. Until she, with a choked voice, asked if he had really done all that alone. Daniel nodded, without pride, just with the firmness of someone who knows exactly what he did and why. She then said she wanted to understand. I wanted to know how someone could plan something so detailed without letting anything show. Daniel crossed his arms, took a deep breath and spoke without raising his voice. He said he didn't start with a plan, but with an instinct. Something inside him that said there was something wrong, something that wasn't said but screamed between the lines. She said that for a long time she tried to save a relationship that was already dead, because she believed that love could do anything. But love, alone, does not sustain those who do not want to stay. She said every choice she made over the past few months was to not only protect what was left of him, but to show her, and the world, that silence can also be a scream. And when he finished, Helena looked at him with tears in her eyes, but not with guilt or remorse. They were the tears of someone who for the first time saw the depth of the abyss he had dug with his own feet. He said he never thought he would be able to do it. That she loved him, but in a selfish way, like someone who thinks love is static and will be there even when everything is ignored. She said there was no way back, she knew. But I needed to ask for forgiveness. Not to get back together. Just to try to carry on with what little dignity was left. Daniel didn't respond right away. He just watched her, like someone watching a leafless tree trying to remain standing at the end of autumn. And then he said that forgiveness, for him, was not a period, but a comma. That he no longer held anger, but he also wouldn't offer redemption. That she was not his enemy, but she was no longer his home. Helena nodded, her eyes empty. She got up, walked to the door, and before leaving, she said in an almost inaudible voice that perhaps he was the only true thing she had in her life. And he left without waiting for a response. Time took its course. The changes in the company were consolidated, and Helena requested a transfer to a smaller branch, in another city, away from the spotlight, away from the whispers that continued to haunt her. It was no longer the name mentioned in meetings as an example. Now it was a reminder of what happens when you lose the line between ambition and disloyalty. Daniel, in turn, did not celebrate victories. You didn't seek recognition. He continued working, but with a lightness that he hadn't experienced in years. He began to reconnect with old friends, resume forgotten hobbies, and allow himself spaces that previously didn't fit into his routine. It was in one of these unpretentious meetings that he met Sophia. Sophia was discreet, intelligent, with an ironic sense of humor that disarmed even the hardest days. I was working on an environmental project linked to one of the partner companies and met him at a lecture where he reluctantly agreed to talk about business ethics. They exchanged looks, then some words, and eventually coffee. There was no rush. She respected his silence, and he admired the lightness with which she led her life. Little by little, without them realizing it, the pain gave way to the possibility of something new. Daniel didn't talk about the past, and Sophia didn't ask. But she could tell, in the careful gestures, in the prolonged silences and in the sometimes distant looks, that there was something buried there. It wasn't his place to dig. It was just being if he wanted to be. And he wanted to. Months later, on a quiet afternoon, while they were organizing old boxes in the basement of his house, Sophia found a thick, sealed envelope, with Helena's name written in handwriting. He asked if he wanted me to throw it away. Daniel hesitated. I said no, that maybe it was time to finally close that chapter. He took the envelope, sat down at the table and looked at it for long minutes. He didn't open it. It just burned him. The paper turned to gray, and with it, everything that no longer needed to be carried. Sophia didn't ask anything. She just sat down next to him and placed her hand on his. There, in that touch, Daniel knew he was free. And what awaited him, after all, was not the end. It was the fresh start. Helena, in turn, woke up every day with a new version of herself trying to be born. It wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of loneliness was crushing. Others where she could breathe and believe she had learned something. He never tried to contact Daniel again. I knew I had crossed a line from which there is no turning back. But sometimes I dreamed about him. In dreams, he still smiled at her. And that was both consolation and punishment. I now understood that true love is not the one that resists everything, but the one that refuses to live with lies. And that choices made in the dark, one day, are exposed in the harshest light. She continued to live. But with a type of silence that only those who have lost someone know, not through death, but through decision. And that loss, she would carry with her forever. With the silence left after that envelope turned to ash, something inside Daniel finally found a kind of closure that no conversation would have provided. The destruction of that evidence, which could continue to serve as emotional ammunition, represented much more than a symbolic act. It was the materialization of a choice, to move forward without looking back. What began as cold revenge, executed with precision and patience, had now emptied itself of hatred. The man who once suffered in silence, humiliated between the lines of a corroded marriage, now no longer fed on the pain. There was another space emerging within him, a calm that came not from the absence of conflict but from the understanding that surviving the fall is less about taking revenge and more about rebuilding. And it was during this time of reconstruction that the layers of life were reorganized, not abruptly, but like someone arranging furniture after a storm, one item at a time, one room at a time. Sophia became part of the routine, with the gentleness of someone who doesn't demand space, but gradually conquers it. Sundays, previously silent and long, were now filled with conversations that ranged from lightness to deep reflections on life and its contradictions. Daniel didn't hide his marks, but he also didn't make an altar of them. He learned, over time, to talk about himself without the anger that once consumed him. And it was in this process that he began to understand what he had actually lost. It wasn't just the woman, nor the marriage, nor the image of a well-structured life. It was the illusion that love alone would be enough. It was the naivety of believing that the loyalty of one would not be enough for two. Realizing this, even if late, was liberating. But also painful. Because the biggest dilemma was not whether or not to forgive the betrayal. It was forgiving himself for having stayed so long where he was no longer welcome. For having insisted on a silence that, instead of protecting, only postponed the inevitable. On the other side of the story, Helena remained in the exile she chose. The smaller city where he lived offered him the anonymity he needed, but also the isolation he had never known. Social events turned into video calls that she avoided answering. Professional respect, which previously came naturally, now needed to be earned with double effort. Not because of her skills, but because she wore an expression that revealed wear and tear, an open wound. She became more introspective, less impulsive, more observant. For the first time in his life, he began to listen more than speak. Her new routine was based on silence, at work and on long nights, where Daniel's absence echoed like a sound that she tried not to admit she still heard. One afternoon, after a lecture on business ethics, Helena was approached by a young, recent graduate, who recognized her from a long time ago. The girl said that she had always admired her, that she had read her old articles and that she dreamed of having the same courage to lead projects with such intensity. Helena smiled and thanked her, but something about that admiration destabilized her. For the first time, he was afraid of inspiring someone who didn't deserve it. She now carried the awareness that she had failed not only as a wife, but as a reference. The recognition that I previously sought as fuel was now a mirror. A mirror that showed more than wrinkles or tiredness. It showed a woman who, after losing everything, began to discover herself. And this discovery was bitter, but transformative. Daniel, even when he was back on his feet, still occasionally visited the memory of everything he had been through. Not with nostalgia, but with a kind of respect for everything that built it. He started writing. First in old notebooks, then in text files. There he put his reflections on relationships, ethics, on how love sometimes turns into a silent addiction. I wrote not to accuse, but to understand. That became therapeutic, a way of understanding your own emotions without needing to justify them. Sophia, always discreet, supported him, but did not invade. She knew this was part of the process. And he, for the first time, felt that he was with someone who understood the necessary space between two people so that love does not become confused with dependence. It was in this scenario of reconstruction that the unexpected invitation appeared. A large business conference in another state selected Daniel to participate in a panel on transformative leadership strategies. The invitation also included Helena, who in turn, had been recognized for her professional reinvention efforts after the scandal. It was the first time that their names appeared together on the same program since the end of everything. When he learned of the coincidence, Daniel did not react with discomfort. He just accepted it. He had overcome it. At least that's what I believed. Helena, when she saw her name next to his, felt dizzy that made her sit on the edge of the bed and stare at the floor for long minutes. I knew it would be inevitable. I would need to see him. And I didn't know if I was ready. The event took place in an elegant convention center, packed with people from all corners. When Daniel arrived, he felt a cold feeling in his stomach that didn't come from fear, but from a strange kind of anticipation. Not by finding her again, but by finding himself again in that context where everything had started to fall apart. On the panel, they sat at opposite ends. They didn't speak to each other, but they looked at each other. And in that look, without hostility, there was only the recognition of two worlds that once touched, but now followed parallel trajectories. When it was his turn to speak, Daniel talked about the importance of reinventing oneself after ruptures, of transforming losses into awareness, and about how true power lies in knowing when to let go. He didn't mention names. But Helena understood every word. And, when it was his turn, he spoke about image reconstruction, about ethics as practice and not as discourse, and about how some lessons come not from victories, but from the most humiliating falls. She was applauded. But Daniel remained silent, just watching. With respect. No pain. As they left the panel, they crossed the corridor. For the first time since that meeting in the boardroom, they were alone again. Helena stopped. Daniel too. The world around him seemed to slow down. She just said she was happy to see him well. He responded with a wave and a light smile, which carried more compassion than any hurt. Helena then, with her eyes down, said that she did not expect forgiveness, but that she hoped he had found peace. Daniel replied that, yes, he had found it. But now he understood that peace wasn't about forgetting, it was about accepting. And he wished the same for her. They exchanged one last look. And they went in opposite directions. There was no hug. There was no goodbye. Just silence between two people who, somehow, were finally free. And as the footsteps echoed on the marble floor of that convention center, Daniel thought about how life, even when it seems tragic, can have a finer sense of justice than any sentence. He hadn't beaten Helena. He had defeated himself. And that, perhaps, was the greatest of all new beginnings. There was still one conversation to be had. Not with her, but with someone who was now part of her new world. And this conversation would be, perhaps, the biggest challenge that still lay ahead. Because certain new beginnings require more than courage, they require delivery. And he was ready. That night, after the Congress, Daniel returned to the hotel with a strange uneasiness running through his thoughts. It wasn't pain. Nor regret. It was something harder to name, as if part of him was touching one last edge of the past, feeling for the first time that he could finally let it go completely. Meeting Helena again, hearing her words without looking away, recognizing in her a transformed woman, or at least in the process, had produced a type of unexpected relief. He no longer wanted punishment, no longer wanted her to suffer as he did. He realized that he had overcome that desire for emotional compensation. Now what I wanted was to follow, but for real. No residue, no invisible weights. And that required him to be honest with whoever was next to him now. Sophia deserved this. More than that, he deserved to live a love without shadows. The next morning, as the sun stretched its first rays through the bedroom window, Daniel called Sophia. She answered with a soft voice, still choked with sleep, and he smiled when he heard her ask if everything was okay. He said yes, that he would come back that afternoon and that he would like to talk to her, without urgency, but sincerely. Sophia, even without understanding the reason, realized from the tone that it was not a crisis, but a necessary step. She responded with, "I'll be here," and Daniel felt that, once again, she had understood without him needing to explain. That moved him, the way she didn't pressure him, how she knew that some silences are just spaces between one breath and another, not walls. The flight was smooth, but Daniel's head was traveling at the opposite speed. As the plane crossed the clouds, he mentally reviewed the details of what they had experienced since the beginning. He remembered the first time Sophia's fingers touched his by chance, over coffee. The look she gave her when she elegantly disagreed with something. The first time they laughed together until they lost track of time. They were vivid memories, but until that moment, he still carried them with the caution of someone afraid of becoming attached again. Now, he felt he could give himself completely, without restraint, without reservations. But to do so, I needed to open a door that I had previously kept closed, I needed to tell everything. Not what Helena did. But what did he do? He needed to talk about his part, how he devised a strategy to fall, how he fed his own pain until it became a weapon, and how, in the middle of this process, he almost lost his own essence. He arrived home late in the afternoon. Sophia was in the garden, working with the plants, her hair tied up in an unassuming bun, her feet bare on the grass. When she saw him, she smiled as she always did, without exaggeration, but with presence. He came over, kissed her forehead, sat down next to her and was silent for a few minutes. She didn't ask anything. Just waited. Then he started talking. He said he needed her to hear something important. It wasn't a confession in the conventional sense, but a revelation of who he was, what he did, and what he felt in the months before their reunion. He told how he discovered the betrayal, how he decided not to confront it, but to create a way out that would hurt just as much. He explained the calculated moves, the silent agreements, the moments when he felt invaded by his own anger, but he continued coldly. He said he doesn't regret having acted intelligently, but that today, looking back, he understands that if he had continued down that path, he would have become someone he wouldn't recognize. Sophia heard everything in silence. He didn't interrupt him, he didn't judge. Her eyes, firm, followed each word attentively, as if she were also trying to fit the pieces of the man she knew with the image of the one who was now speaking. When he finished, he looked down, expecting perhaps a shocked comment, or a sudden departure. But she just took a deep breath, took his hand and said, "We all have choices." And that what defined someone was not just what they did in times of pain, but what they chose to do after understanding that pain. He said he wasn't that man of revenge, but the man who was now there, telling everything, vulnerable and whole. And that, for her, was more powerful than any past. Daniel felt a deep emotion invade him, not because he had been forgiven, he hadn't even asked for forgiveness, but because he had been welcomed. And welcoming has the power to heal what justice alone can never achieve. From then on, something changed between them. It wasn't just affection or passion. It was partnership on a deeper level, where the two recognized each other's wounds and still chose to remain. Sophia became part not only of his present, but also of his future. They began to share more concrete plans, trips, renovations, professional projects and, over time, they even talked about children. Daniel, who had once been afraid to try again, now saw the possibility of building something lasting, not like someone rebuilding a ruin, but like someone planting in new, fertile soil, already knowing the value of water and light. One Sunday, while walking through a crafts fair, they saw an elderly couple walking hand in hand. Daniel watched for a while. Sophia noticed and asked what he saw there. He responded that, for the first time, he could imagine growing old alongside someone without fear. He said that before, even when he loved, there was a hidden fear of being abandoned, exchanged, forgotten. Now he felt that if he were ever left, he would still know who he was. Sophia smiled, and at that moment, he was sure that this was where he belonged. Helena, even far away, occasionally came across traces of her old life. Company news, comments from old colleagues, declined invitations to events where he knew he would meet Daniel. He never tried to contact me again. I felt that any attempt would sound like an invasion, like an attempt to revive something that had clearly died. But internally he knew that his journey was not over yet. He began to devote himself to lecturing, not as an authority figure, but as someone who knew the fall. She began helping women in the process of emotional reconstruction, not as a redeemer, but as a witness to what vanity and emotional blindness can cause. He did not speak about Daniel publicly. But between the lines, she made it clear that she had known a love that changed her, not through permanence, but through loss. Once, at the end of a lecture, a young woman approached and asked what hurt the most in her entire career. Helena thought for a few seconds and replied that it was realizing that, sometimes, we only understand what love was after we destroy it. He said there is no greater pain than recognizing the value of something when you no longer have the chance to care for it. The girl thanked him, moved. And Helena, returning home that night, cried. Not of regret, but with lucidity. The full awareness of what was, and what now was. In the midst of all this, the world went on. Daniel and Sophia, little by little, allowed themselves new traditions, coffees on Saturdays, reading together at night, small escapes to neighboring cities where no one recognized them. He never mentioned Helena again. Not because he forgot her, but because he had put each memory in its rightful place. It was part of the story. But it was no longer part of life. And when he felt in doubt, he looked at Sophia, and remembered that he was no longer the man who expected answers from the world. Now he was the man who created his own questions and accepted the answers that life gave him. Later that year, a letter arrived. No sender. But he recognized the handwriting. It was not an attempt at rapprochement. It was a letter of gratitude. In it, Helena thanked him for not having publicly destroyed her image, for having maintained dignity even when he had every reason to retaliate with cruelty. He said he learned, not from his mistakes, but from how he handled them. Daniel read to the end, took a deep breath, folded the paper and put it in a box. He didn't respond. It didn't need to. Some messages are not for continuing conversations. They are just to close cycles. And in that silence, finally, their story ended completely. Not with screams. But with understanding. And so, life, which never tires of surprising, now set the stage for something bigger. Something definitive. Something that, finally, would give meaning to everything that had been experienced up to that point. Life sometimes has an almost cruel way of teaching us the value of silence, presence, and the choices we make while we believe we are in control. In Helena's case, the lesson arrived with an uncomfortable slowness, like a pain that does not heal with time, but which turns into a constant reminder of what could have been. 2 years after her last conversation with Daniel, she found herself in front of a mirror in a rented room in a city she still couldn't call home. Work remained stable, but lackluster. It was recognized by some, but feared by many. The name that once opened doors now caused hesitation. What she valued most, respect and prestige, had become a burden, a reminder that the corporate world can be ruthless to those who forget that integrity is not optional. She still lived alone, and although she had been involved with some men, nothing lasted. None of them saw in her the woman that Daniel once saw, and she also couldn't offer any other version than the one being reconstructed. He carried an emptiness that he couldn't fill successfully, and sometimes, when Sundays stretched into dense silence, he revisited in his thoughts the moments when he had everything in his hands and decided to risk something that wasn't worth the gamble. There was no self-pity, just lucidity. He knew that what he lost could never be recovered. On the other side of this story, Daniel followed a different beat. His face was more mature, his gaze calmer, but there was a firmness in his gestures that was previously overshadowed by the need to please. The journey he took did not make him a hard man, but a whole man. With Sophia by his side, he experienced the kind of love that doesn't require performance, that doesn't require constant reaffirmation. It was a love of presence, of comfortable silence, of complicity. The past no longer weighed on his shoulders. It had become part of his luggage, but no longer a burden. When I looked at Sophia, I didn't see a replacement. See a sequel. A new chapter written with clean ink. When they finally decided to get married, they had a small, discreet ceremony, with close friends and without ostentation. In exchanging vows, Daniel did not promise perfection, but he promised truth. Sophia, in turn, did not promise eternal stability, but constant presence, even on uncertain days. It was a real, conscious love, built on the acceptance of imperfection. And that was all he needed. It was on a warm spring afternoon that something unexpected happened. Daniel received a call from the local hospital. A young nurse explained that a woman had been hospitalized after fainting in public and that among her belongings was a letter addressed to him. Her name, Helena. His number was on a note inside the bag, next to old documents and a folder containing lecture notes. The nurse's voice was calm, but there was a delicate tone that suggested something more serious. Daniel hesitated, but went. Not out of nostalgia. But for humanity. Arriving there, he found Helena pale, thinner, but lucid. She smiled when she saw him, a weak but genuine smile. He said he didn't expect to see him, but that letter was his final attempt to say what had been stuck in his throat for years. Daniel sat down. He didn't touch her. Just listened. She spoke of loneliness, of the nights she cried without knowing which hurt more, the loss of him or the loss of herself. He said he wasn't there to ask for anything. I just wanted him to know that the impact he made wasn't just because of the pain, but because of the strength with which she learned to see herself after everything. Daniel took a deep breath. He said he forgave her. Not because I needed it. But because he knew that the pain she carried was punishment enough. And that everyone deserves a chance to end a cycle with peace. Helena closed her eyes, moved. He said that was all he needed to hear. There was no dramatization. Just two people saying goodbye to a past that, somehow, continued to live among them. He left the hospital feeling like he had completed something that time alone could not complete. When he told Sophia, she wasn't surprised. He just said he was proud of him. And with that, he was sure he chose right. A woman who is not afraid of the other's past because she knows the value of the present she built together. A few weeks later, Daniel was invited to open an international conference on ethics and personal reinvention. His talk went viral. Not because of his eloquence, but because of the depth with which he approached the theme of overcoming without revenge. He said that great new beginnings require small internal deaths and that, sometimes, losing everything we thought was essential is the only way to discover who we really are. He spoke without mentioning names, but anyone who knew his story knew that every word was lived, felt, real. At the end of the event, he was approached by several professionals, young and old, who saw him as more than a successful executive. They saw an example of how to transform pain into direction, failure into learning, betrayal into emotional autonomy. He didn't seek to be a hero. But it became a reference. Helena, after her recovery, decided to permanently leave the corporate environment. I felt like I had accomplished what I could there. She opened a small consultancy aimed at helping women in the process of emotional and professional reconstruction. He worked with real stories, gave advice based on his own trajectory and maintained a blog where he wrote sincere reflections on self-knowledge, choices, losses and new beginnings. It was not an attempt at public redemption. It was just her new way of staying alive in a way that made sense. I lived alone, but I no longer regretted it. He had a few true friends, and every now and then he would meet someone who made his heart beat differently. I didn't idealize anyone else. Not even herself. And that, finally, was freedom. Sophia and Daniel remained firm. They had a daughter. A girl with dark eyes and an easy laugh, who brought home a new reason to believe that love, when built with honesty and patience, has the strength to heal even the deepest wounds. Fatherhood changed Daniel once again. Now not as a reaction to pain, but as a response to love. Watching her grow, watching her discover the world, he knew that the entire path, even tortuous, had prepared him to be the father he now was. And when, years later, his daughter asked him how he knew Sophia was the right woman, he replied that it was the moment he realized he could be whole, without needing to hide his broken parts. And she understood. As only a child who grows up among truths is capable of understanding. And that's how this story ends. Not with miraculous endings, nor with incoherent twists. But with real people, real choices and consequences that teach. Each character found their answer, their new road. Some arrived in pain. Others lightly. But everyone, in some way, understood that life is not defined by the mistakes we make, but by what we do after we recognize them. And now tell me, what did you think of this story? Comment below, I want to know your opinion about each character. Would you have acted like Daniel? Can you understand Helena? And what do you think of Sophia? Take advantage and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories like this. And remember, this channel does not support, encourage or romanticize any type of betrayal. We are here to show that every choice has a price. And in all truth, an impact. Until the next story.